you know, it's interesting. You don't want to be out in the open when this happens. You want to be inside. So if you look at this and you look at the dust composition, now one thing that you will notice here is that the dust composition here is very different from other weather phenomena. So looking at the particle size distribution, you see that during a Haboob storm, you have a lot of particles that are on the order of 100 micron. And these particles, they're very large, they're inertial particles. They're not like the atmospheric pollution that we typically talk about, like the PM10 particles, so particles that are smaller than 10 micron, which act more like tracer particles. These ones deviate from the flow and have interesting physics. So this is something that you may see if you visit Phoenix. But in terms of particle-laden flows, there is actually a very wide regime space and parameter space. There are at least 3 important parameters. So density ratio over here, which can vary substantially whether you're in a liquid-solid configuration where the density ratio is really close to 1, or whether you're in a solid air configuration where the density ratio is on the order of 10,000s. You have volume fraction, and you also have relative size. So these are all, well, some of the important parameters. And then you have applications related to these, like fluidized bed reactors, sediment transport, biological aerosols, and so on. And there is this video I like showing to people because I think it's genius the way it was done. So this is Mark Rober, a YouTuber that's famous in the United States. He was an engineer with NASA and liked science communication and eventually started his YouTube channel doing this. So he created a fluidized bed in a hot tub. So I'll let you see how it looks like. So when the air is turned on, it's like a fluid. When the air is turned off, it's solid, like you would expect from sand. So you can swim in there. All right. So some of the applications I care about are related to aerospace engineering. So this is something that's of particular interest to me. When you have these kind of aircrafts operating in desert environments, there is a lot of dust that's being resuspended, and this dust can damage the aircrafts. It can lead to different aerodynamics. So we want to be able to predict these effects and possibly mitigate them if we can. So the question that I'm trying to address, the overarching theme to this research is how can we model particles that are in the size range of 10 to 100 micron in wall-bounded turbulence. So if we want to do that, we have to understand the structure of a wall-bounded turbulent flow first. So this is the first step. Here I'm showing you a visualization of the streamwise velocity field in turbulent channel flow at friction Reynolds number of 5200. So that's fairly high turbulence. And you can see here there is a really huge hierarchy of scales. So if you zoom in on these little portions here, so starting with the blue rectangle, so this is zoomed in view here, you can still see a lot of turbulent structures there. And if you further zoom in on this red box here, you'll see that there are still some coherent flow structures and features on this scale. So what turbulent theory tells us is that we can split this flow into viscous layer, buffer layer, and log layer, where you have the mean velocity profile that has a linear shape in the viscous sublayer. It follows a log layer for positions over about 30 or 40 wall units, and in between you have this buffer layer. So another thing to also keep in mind is that as you increase Reynolds number, well, what happens is that all these structures get squished. They get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's important in particle-laden flows because typically we're going to have a certain particle size, let's say 100 micron. If you increase the turbulence structures get increasingly small in comparison with the particle size. So this is the first consideration when we attempt to model these kind of flows. The first consideration is what's the relative particle size? So let's say we have a characteristic size dp, so characteristic particle size. What we can do is build a non-dimensional diameter which is dP divided by the viscous length in a wall-bounded turbulent flow. And if you have normalized diameter that's below a cutoff of roughly 5 here, we can assume that these particles are very small. They live in the viscous sublayer. Basically, the flow on their scale is very simple. It's a uniform flow or a simple shear flow. And that allows us to do a lot of modeling. So this is going to be considered as the point particle limit. If you have particles that are larger than dP plus of 5, those particles are too large. They may have a size that's comparable to the flow structures in the turbulent boundary layer. And the simple models that we have are not going to apply. So these are harder to model and require more computational effort. So speaking of the point particles first, the flow on their scale is very simple. This allows us to use drag laws like Stokes' drag, if you're familiar with that, or any kind of other correlations that would increase this range for increasing Reynolds number, like the Schiller-Neumann correlation. And there have been a lot of correlations developed for these kind of flows. So you can use this bit of modeling and theory to reduce the computational cost. Now, if your particle is finite size, so again, it has a size that's comparable to the turbulent flow structures in the boundary layer, we're not going to be able to use that Stokes drag or Schiller-Neumann drag. It's going to be more complicated. And here what I'm showing you is experiments from Professor Longmire's group at University of Minnesota, where they put a particle with a size of dP plus of 110 in a relatively high Reynolds number turbulent boundary layer. So this is showing a wall parallel view. So these are experiments. This is a shadow of the laser that you see here. And you can see that the particle is relatively large compared to these turbulent eddies. And what they also showed is that the particle trajectories have really interesting dynamics. The particles can roll along the wall, they can slide, they can do sudden liftoffs, like you can sort of see here. You know, the particle will go along the wall and then do a liftoff suddenly. So all these trajectories would not be described by common drag laws like Stokes drag and so on. Those just don't work. Okay. So we talked about a first consideration, which is the particle size, which will dictate whether we're going to look at the particles as point particles or as finite size particles. Now, when we try to study this, we also have to keep in mind the computational costs. So we're going to have resolution requirements. So if we assume that delta F here is the smallest resolved scale in your simulation, here you have a choice on how you can approach the problem. You can make your smallest resolved scale very small, so much smaller than the particle diameter. This is going to give you a microscale view of the flow. So basically, you're looking at the super zoomed in region where you see the particles that are being fully resolved interacting with one another, and you capture the flow in between the particles. So this is a microscale view of the flow. Now, if you decide to spend your computational cost on larger features, you're going to need to zoom out. Now your smallest resolved scale is on the order of maybe 10 particles. The flow on the scale of the particles is no longer resolved because we don't have that resolution. But we can track many of these particles, and maybe we can track order million or maybe order billion particles like this, and capture much larger scales than you would normally capture with limited computational power doing a microscale view. And you can also further zoom out and look at much larger scales. So here your smallest resolved scale is perhaps 1,000 diameters. And this is a pipe flow here, and maybe this whole section of the pipe is going to be one grid point in your simulation. So you're doing an average perspective, an Eulerian method typically. So this allows you to look at the macro scale, and if you're interested in industrial applications where you have scales varying from 1 to 100 meters, this is really the only thing that you can possibly do. So why can't we just do the best simulation, the most fully resolved simulation ever? You know, why can't we just do that all the time? So here I'm showing you an experiment that's done at National Energy and Technology Lab in the United States. This is a circulating fluidized bed. So this is a section of this lab scale fluidized bed that's 1 meter long, and you can see that you have a lot of particles there. So if you do a little bit of pre-analysis here, we're going to have particle diameters of 100 micron, the reactor diameter. So this is just for this 1 meter section here. If you do a fully resolved particle simulation, so particle resolved direct numerical simulation, typically you need at minimum 10 grid points across the diameter of the particle. So you're going to use that. This is going to lead to 10 trillion grid points just for this simulation of this section of your circulating fluidized beds. Is that too much? Is that too little? So I did some back of the envelope calculation, assuming that you have a Cartesian grid solver that's fairly efficient, and you're using 100,000 points per CPU, which is kind of traditional for these Cartesian grid solvers. Well, you will need 10 times Aurora, which is the largest supercomputer from the Department of Energy in the United States. And this one is an exaflop computer. It costs $500 million, so you need 10 of these to run that simulation. So clearly, it's not going to be possible to fully resolve all scales in all situations. I'm sure AI will answer all the questions, and you know, they won't need us anymore. Yeah. If you can figure out AI to do all of this, then you know.
No, I mean in terms of computer power.
Yeah.
The AI would not consume $500 million for their operation, but maybe tens of.
Oh yeah, possibly. Yeah. Well, if they have to crunch numbers all day long, yeah. Okay, so we have these two approaches now. We have particle resolved DNS. This is where you fully resolve the particles, and typically this is going to apply for finite size particles. This is where you need it the most. On this scale here, I have the resolution, right? So you're looking at micro scales here. And you also have Euler-Lagrange methods where the flow at the scale of the particle is modeled, so that it allows us to reduce the computational cost. Typically, we'll use it to do point particle simulations. So these are just illustrations. In PRDNS, you actually have spheres. In Euler-Lagrange methods, you have points. So we have these two kind of disjoint methods. Yeah. What is like a typical interparticle distance?
Exactly.
Yeah, so if you're looking at a volume fraction of 10 to the negative 3, which is considered as relatively dilute, the interparticle distance is 10 diameters. So in dusty flows, like I'm showing here, the typical volume fractions are going to be from 10 to the negative 6 to 10 to the negative 3. So the interparticle distance can be very large. Yeah. Okay, yes, so these two methods have been developed kind of in a disjoint manner. And a lot of the work that I'm showing here is going to be on how you can connect these two methods. So the one thing to keep in mind, though, for the applications I'm interested in, which is wall-bounded turbulence with particle-laden flows, is that for a given particle size, let's say 100 micron, as you increase the Reynolds number, the flow scales get squished. They get progressively smaller. So you're actually going up on the scale of dp plus here. Right? You go from perhaps a dp plus of 0.1 to a dp plus of 100. So you may be in a regime where Euler-Lagrange simulations work, but as you increase the Reynolds number, you're going to be violating those assumptions, and you're going to be going to a regime where PRDNS is the more appropriate method to use. So that's why we need a formulation that kind of captures these both limits and makes sense and would be able to connect the two limits. All right, so how do we do that? I'm going to start with the basic Navier-Stokes equations here. So the Navier-Stokes equations, I think the audience is familiar with. We're going to have no-slip boundary conditions as well. So these are the equations that describe the flow in between the particles. Now, in particle-laden flows, we're not going to be able to just solve the Navier-Stokes equations because they're very computationally expensive. They will not converge unless you actually resolve the space in between the particles. But if you do this kind of method, you can maybe solve the flow around one particle or maybe a handful of particles. So if I go back to this little schematic here that I have of the target resolution, like how well resolved do you want your simulation to be? I have this magnifying glass that allows me to look at the microscale, mesoscale, macroscale. Well, this magnifying glass here, I can formulate it mathematically. And mathematically, it's going to be a filtering operation of a certain size. That's the filter size, delta F. And depending on how large or how small is the filter size in comparison with the particles, I can basically zoom in or zoom out. So this is the filtering operation here. When I do this, I have to punch out the solid, and then I'm left with this fluid region, and I can average the flow in this fluid region. If my filter size is very, very small, I'm approaching a DNS. If I'm very coarse, I'm going to do very coarse averaging. So mathematically, this is what the fluid volume fraction looks here, which is basically the ratio of the volume occupied by the fluid divided by the total volume inside this averaging volume. So it expresses like that. This also gives me the volume filtered fluid velocity. So these are convolutions between a filter kernel, and you can choose different shapes of the filter kernels. And the product of the indicator function and the velocity here, or just the indicator function here. So anything that's going to be smaller than the filter width is going to be unresolved. And anything that's larger than the filter width is going to be well resolved. So these are the limits that I'm going to talk about today. The first limit is when the filter size is much larger compared to the particle size. This is the point particle limit. The particles basically appear as little points inside of our filter or filtered region. There is this is going to require a lot of modeling, which I'll present some of it. There is this awkward intermediate limit where the filter size is on the same scale as the particle diameter, which everyone has been, happy to ignore. So I'll talk about a little bit later, because here you have just partially resolved dynamics, and that also requires modeling. And then there is a limit where the filter size is very small compared to the particle diameter, where your flow is basically well resolved. However, there is still, so it's not quite fully a DNS yet, but there is still an effect of the particles, because even if you make your filter very small, it still gets truncated a little bit by the particle, and that has an effect. Okay, so here there is little or no modeling required. So let's start with the conservation equations, so mass conservation. Now, I'm going to assume that we have an incompressible flow, so divergence of u is equal to 0. And then I'm going to apply this filtering operation to this equation. And when you do that, you get this transport equation. So this continuity equation where you have the fluid volume fraction here and you have the filter velocity. So that's the mass conservation that's been volume filtered. Now let's go to the momentum conservation. Same story here. I have the Navier-Stokes equation. I apply this volume filtering operation, and then after long and tedious math, it turns into this equation right here. So it's a similar kind of equation. So you have the left-hand side here. You have fluid volume fraction and volume filtered velocities. On the right-hand side now, it's a little more complicated. We have these additional tensors that appear. So the first one is the filtered stress tensor. Now, the filtered stress tensor here is fairly simple because it expresses in terms of all these filtered quantities. So I have a green check mark here, which indicates that this is a closed tensor. I have these additional 3 tensors now, or 2 tensors on a vector. So R mu here is called the residual viscous stress tensor, and this one is unclosed. There is this vector here, that's the momentum exchange term. So I'll talk about that a lot today. also unclosed because it contains the unfiltered total fluid stress. And I also have a subfilter scale tensor because this filtering operation is similar to what you get when you do an LES. You get the subgrid scale tensor. So basically, it's the same thing here with a slight difference coming from the volume fraction. All right, so these are the equations. And they're going to be the same equations whether you do a PRDNS or whether you do a point particle method. It's just that the assumptions and the closures are going to be different. So for the particles, I'm going to assume that we have spherical particles. We have Newton's second law here. So this is essentially mass times acceleration equal forces applied on the particle. We have conservation of angular momentum as well. And we can assume that these particles are rigid, so we have rigid body motion as well. So these are equations. These equations are not too complicated. The one thing to keep in mind is that this fluid stress tensor on the surface of the particle has to be modeled somehow. So that requires a closure. And then there are collisional forces. So there are a lot of models out there on how to handle collisions. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I'm going to say that we use a linearized spring dashpot model, which is just like a simple collision model in a lot of these simulations. All right, so in my title, I said that this is going to be a unifying framework, so I will address that now. And this framework is going to allow us to do PRDNS when the filter size is very small compared to the diameter of the particle, and Euler-Lagrange or point particle method when the filter size is very large. So I'm going to start with the latter, the point particle limit. Now, these are the equations that I recapped here, and we're going to apply appropriate treatment in the limit of very coarse filter sizes to do a point particle method. Now, the first thing that you have to figure out in these equations is how to compute the fluid volume fraction. So it turns out that it's not hard at all. It's actually fairly simple in the Euler-Lagrange method. If you start out with the particle volume fraction. Now, the particle volume fraction is this integral which looks complicated, but it ends up being a sum over the particles. Here you have a particle volume times this filter kernel that's centered on the particle. So I'm showing you an example of what this looks like with 3 particles in yellow. So this is the particle volume fraction and a filter size that's 5 times the diameter of the particle. Now, this you can compute very fast in your simulation. This is a very efficient computation. And from there, you can get your fluid volume fraction, which is 1 minus the particle volume fraction. So calculating volume fractions is not a problem. Now, you have these closures to determine. Now, the first one, which is, I'm ready for some questions here, okay? The subfilter scale tensor. In a lot of these methods and these simulations, people will assume that the subfilter scale tensor is negligible. So let me try to argue why that is. If you're doing a proper point particle DNS or Euler-Lagrange simulation, you're going to have a wave number associated with a particle that's very small compared to the turbulence wave numbers. So you have your Kolmogorov scale right here, and your particle is smaller than the Kolmogorov scale. If you do this properly, your filter is going to be 4 or 5 times larger than the particle diameter, and the wave number associated with the filter should still be below or larger than the wave number associated with the Kolmogorov scale. So if you do this properly like this, then you can justify that the subfilter scale tensor can be neglected. Of course, there are some exceptions, but what I would like to also add is that modeling this tensor is very challenging, and we don't have models that work in a variety of situations. So this is still a very active area of research. All right, what about the residual viscous stress tensor? So the second one. It turns out that that's the tensor responsible for the effective viscosity of suspensions. If you're looking at dusty flows, the density ratio is very high. The effective viscosity plays no role, so that tensor is negligible. But if you're in a liquid-solid configuration, you can introduce an effective viscosity model in this tensor to capture that effect. But it's negligible for dusty flows. Now, what about the momentum exchange term between the fluid and the particles? Well, you can do a little more work here, assuming that the particle diameter is very small compared to the filter size, and then you'll find out that there's this expression here, which is the drag force. So you can bring in the drag force, you can use Stokes drag, you can use Schiller-Norman drag, you can use drag correlations that are corrected for Reynolds number, volume fraction, and so on. So there is a zoo of these drag correlations out there, and you can use whichever one you want.
Since you said you were waiting for questions, at which point do you model turbulence? Do you have anything like some Greek model for turbulence
Yeah.
situations?
Yeah, I mean that's
for the radiant stress.
Yeah, that's a
Max Marguerite stress.
yeah, that's a great question. So we don't do any of that. We just don't model because, again, the assumption here is that the filter is still very small compared to the Kolmogorov scale. But if you wanted to do coarser simulation, so now you're getting into an LES, you need to supply some kind of model for that. And what we know is that the Smagorinsky models and all those models don't really apply in particle-laden flows because you have a backward energy transfer from the smallest scales to large scales due to the particles that's not captured by those eddy viscosity models. So you need something else, and it's not really clear what it is. Yeah. So it's still an active area of research. I haven't done work on that myself, but I know that other people are. All right, so I'll show you some applications with this method just to convince you that you can get really good statistics and good predictions with this. The first one here is the particle-laden channel flow. So this is something that we studied back in 2023. So we have a Reynolds number of 180. This is a density flow configuration. The density ratio is 833. And we have these particles that are very small. They're either 0.36 in terms of wall units or 0.8. So we have two different channels. The volume fractions vary from about 10 to the negative 4 to about 10 to the negative 3. And the mass fraction is about 0.1 to 1.
Particle density come to a role in your model?
Yeah, really good question. So the particle density comes through, I think it's going to be in the drag force, yeah. It's going to be in the momentum exchange term here. This is going to be affected by the density ratio. So it turns out that for these flows, what matters the most is the mass loading rather than the volume fraction. So the mass loading indicates whether you have strong momentum coupling between the two phases or not. If the mass loading is very small, you don't have a lot of flow modification by the particles. If the mass loading is large, you have significant flow modification. So these are just some snapshots of streamwise velocity right here in particle concentration. So this is the particle-free channel. We added these particles that have a size of 0.8 wall units. And you can kind of see brighter colors there, which means that the flow, bulk velocity increased. These are some of the particle structure that you can see there. And with the smaller particles, we have a reduction in the bulk velocity. So this is just from quick look in Visit, which is the visualization software that we use. But in a more quantitative way, we can look at velocity profiles. So with these, I'm going to call them in a moment, drag reducing particles, you have that the velocity increases, so the flow rate increases with these particles, and it decreases with these particles. And the degree to which it increases or decreases scales with the mass loading. So mass loading has an effect on the intensity of the coupling between the two phases. So we computed this metric, which is called drag reduction factor, and we observed that essentially we have a drag increase of 17% in the case of the smaller particles, and a drag reduction which is significant, about 20% with the larger particles. The reason why we care about this is because this project was funded by Petroleum Research Fund, and they care about transport in pipelines, so anything that can reduce drag in a pipeline is something of interest to them. And using spherical particles is interesting because these particles will not break up compared to other polymers that people have been using. So they're longer lasting. This kind of method also allows you to look at relatively large scales and try to identify the physics. So when we were thinking about, what is causing this drag reduction, we looked at these wall parallel planes, and we observed that there are these streaks, very long streaks of particles. And we noticed that these streaks tend to wedge themselves in between hairpins, right? So what we postulate is that there is this bursting phenomenon that is suppressed. So the way a hairpin vortex forms is that it buckles like that, and then eventually it bursts, and there are some prior studies that show that the bursting accounts for like 45% of the skin friction drag in a channel. And then they reform again through an auto-generative mechanism, but the particles suppress the bursting. So they kind of stabilize these flow structures. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but we also use this method to look at dusty vortex dynamics. For example, a dusty Lambosine vortex, which is very stable in a single phase flow, but the particles can actually destabilize this and introduce hydrodynamic instabilities. We looked at dusty vortex pairs that merge, so co-rotating dusty vortices. And if you don't have particles, then these vortices will kind of diffuse, grow a little bit for a while, and once they are sufficiently large, they will start merging together. If you add particles, what happens is that they get deformed a little bit, and then the particles are being ejected, so the particles that get squeezed in the gap push apart the two vortices for a little bit, and then eventually you have this depleted zone, and then the two vortices merge. So very interesting dynamics. So that's vortex cores. Yeah, so we noticed that each vortex gets split into two vortices, two little vortices, due to this deformation caused by the particles. So they get split, and then the inner vortices, something like that. Inner vortices merge first, and then the outer vortices merge second, something like that. And it is very dependent on the Stokes number. I think something like 700 to 1,000 times larger than the particle diameter. Yeah. Anyway, so circling back to that idea of looking at high Reynolds number wall-bound and turbulent flows with particles, what happens is that we're going to necessarily be going towards higher dp+, right? So we're going to go from point particles to now finite size particles. So I have a visualization here that shows you what a dp+ of 100 particle looks like in this high Reynolds number turbulent channel flow. It's still a very, very tiny particle, as you can see, right? So a very, very small particle. And in comparison, if I had a dp+ of one particle, that would be like a speck of dust, or you wouldn't even notice it there. So I'm going to go back to our formulation, which is based on volume filtering. So this is the equation that we have. Previously, we applied them in the limit of a point particle. Now we're going to make different assumptions. We're going to assume that the filter size is very small compared to the particle diameter, and see what kind of equations we can get and how we're going to solve them. So the first thing to address is, how do you compute the fluid volume fraction? So with the point particle method, it was very straightforward to do it. Now it's a lot harder, actually. So you can go back to how the fluid volume fraction is defined. It's a convolution between the indicator function and the filter kernel. If you try to do this numerically, you will find out that this is very expensive to do. You probably need to have subgrid resolution to be able to compute that with some accuracy. However, if you go a roundabout way, you can use this identity here for the gradient of alpha, and then take the divergence of that. So you end up with a Poisson equation, where here you have the Laplacian of alpha, and on the right-hand side you have a divergence of this term, which is also very fast to compute. So this is an additional Poisson equation that you have to solve in your solver. There is no free lunch. You're going to spend some compute time here on this, but it's not very complicated, and you can use multi-grid solvers and things like that. So here I'm showing you what the fluid volume fraction looks like for varying filter sizes, just to get an idea on how this looks like. This is going towards the PRDNS limit. Here is a filter size that's half of a diameter. I have a sphere here, and you can see that you can tell there is a sphere there based on this volume fraction field. You can take the ISO level fluid volume fraction of 0.5 to basically rebuild the surface of the particle. And this gets sharper and better defined with reducing filter size. If you go to the opposite limit, where you make the filter size progressively larger, now you're going to the Euler-Lagrange limit that, or point particle limit that I talked about earlier, and you get like a diffuse patch here. All right, so let's talk about closures now, because we have a lot of terms to close. Now, the subfilter scale tensor, so it's circling back to this tensor. Here, it's going to be negligible. So let me justify that one more time. In the point particle method, we said that the particle wave number is going to be here. The filter wave number is going to be here. Everything is below the Kolmogorov length scale, so we can neglect that tensor. Here, the justification is a little different. In the case of finite-sized particles, now your particles are larger than a lot of the turbulent structures, larger than the Kolmogorov scale and so on. So their wave number is here, but you need to choose a filter size that's sufficiently small to be below the wavelength, the Kolmogorov scale. So this is the wave number associated with the filter. So you need to have these kind of considerations in mind to be able to do the simulations correctly. And we have, if you're interested on how you can possibly deal with that subfilter scale tensor, we also have more work done on that in this paper.
So the fraction becomes 1 inside the particle?
Correct. Oh, well, for the fluid, for the fluid volume fraction, it's 0. And so,
0. So
yeah.
what is the equation that you solve inside?
Oh, I'm going to address that in a moment.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. I think you're going to be happy with I'm going to show.
Am I going to be happy or not?
You're going to be happy, I think, or maybe upset. Maybe I'll be upset. Okay, what about the residual viscous stress tensor? This one is not actually, honestly, not complicated. You could compute it, but I've done a lot of testing on this, and it's very small, so negligible. You can just neglect it most of the time. All right, what about the momentum exchange term? Now, the momentum exchange term requires you to know what the stress tensor and filter stress tensor on the surface of the particle is. So this one, you have to close it somehow. So I'll show you that you can bring the no-slip boundary condition here to perform the closure. So how do you do that? Well, this unfiltered vector here, so normal dotted with the fluid stress tensor, you can split it into two parts. A part that's based on the resolved stress tensor, and a part that's due to the residual, whatever is left, right, there. So the resolved stress tensor, or resolved part, you can get it right like this, no problem with that. It's based on resolved quantities. For the residual part, it's going to contain the unfiltered stress tensor. If you go back to our papers, especially the one from 2023, we did a bit of treatment here. And you can say that this is approximately equal to this quantity that I'm showing you here. So the important elements of this quantity are going to be the particle velocity at the surface, right? And then there's going to be a slip velocity. This is the most important part. So the difference between the filtered velocity at the surface of the particle and then the solid velocity at that same point. There's going to be this fluid volume fraction on the interface, which is about 0.5, and then there is the interfacial surface density. which is about 2 over delta F for a triangle filter kernel. But you don't have to, you can just compute it directly like this. It's not complicated. So the main problem here is treating the slip velocity. And if you assume that your filter size is very small compared to the particle diameter, and very small means, diameter divided by 3, diameter divided by 4, then you can neglect that part and you can use a no-slip boundary condition there. So that's the main assumption here. Treatment inside of the solid. Okay, so we get to this part. All right, so outside of the solid, we have these equations. So what happens inside of the solid? Well, inside of the solid, alpha f goes to 0, and the filter velocity goes to 0. So you end up with 0 equals 0, and 0 equals 0 here. So everything, you get back to trivial equations and whatnot. So I'm going to be honest, I was greedy. I tried to solve the equations like this, even within the particles, and it doesn't really work, right? It doesn't work. So let me tell you why, okay, why it doesn't work. This is the unfiltered velocity here that you see from a channel flow. So I'm using this as an illustration. This is the superficial velocity. So this is produced from a DNS. This is a superficial velocity, which is alpha f times filtered UF, filtered with a very coarse filter just to show you, these different behaviors. And this is the fluid volume fraction. Now the solid is here, right? All of this is solid. This is the fluid volume fraction equal to 0 here. So basically, as you go inside of the solid, the superficial velocity goes to 0 and the fluid volume fraction goes to 0. Now, why does this matter? It's because you have the convective term, which is alpha UF, which you can call that the superficial velocity, times UF. And you need to build UF at some point in your code to evaluate the convective term. So the UF is going to be the ratio of that superficial velocity and the fluid volume fraction. And when you do this numerically, you're going to get in a situation where you have 0 divided by 0. So you run into round-off errors. And these round-off errors can be multiplied and compounded through the nonlinear convective term, and that can lead to a blow-up. If you have a fixed geometry, you can basically ignore the solid cells, and you can still run it robustly. If you have moving particles like we do, moving solids, then this is for sure going to cause you problems. Okay, so how do you deal with this stuff? Any ideas? Well, you try to avoid the volume fraction formulation. So how do you do that? Well, you do a one field method, or you do a one continuum. I'm just going to call it one continuum. I think in liquid gas methods they call it one fluid formulation. So I'm going to just call it one continuum treatment here. So I have my equations in the fluid region, which is what I just described here. And then you're going to have additional conservation equations for the solid. And you combine these equations together, and you'll see that you get rid of this problem of volume fraction going to 0. So the main question here is what to do with the momentum conservation within the solid.
Sorry. Because when you write the average equations for the fluid region, you are already putting the physics of the solid region, right?
As in where?
Two equations there. When you average these equations out, implicitly assuming some physics.
Yeah, so the main assumption is right. Yeah, the main assumption is right here, which means that the boundary is moving with the solid velocity. That's the effect of the solid. So it appears through this boundary integral that you see here. It's not in the other terms though, right? So this is the term that's going to drive the flow. That's what I'm going to argue right now, yeah. Okay. Okay, so the solid region here, you're going to do something. Here I have mass conservation, and here I have momentum conservation, but we need to figure out what to do with that momentum conservation. So the first treatment that's also been done in the literature is to use rigid body motion. And you have the motion of each particle, so you know the rotational dynamics and so on. So you can build the rigid body motion velocity vector at each location, and you can have this right-hand side. And what this right-hand side will do is it's going to push this continuum particle velocity, UP, towards the rigid body motion, given a relaxation time. And you can even implement it numerically to occur on a dt, or time step scale. So this is one way of doing it. Now this requires you to do a lot of work inside of the particle, as in, you know, come and then figure out the rigid body motion inside of there, and then do this, basically build this term. The second method, which is option 2, which is what I do, is that I'm going to assume that the particle, the solids, are basically empty inside. They're hollow solids, but they're filled with the same fluid as on the outside. So the fluid inside of the particle has the same density and viscosity as outside. However, the interface is has an imposed velocity which comes from F equal ma for the particles. So if you do that, basically assuming that there is a fluid inside of the particle, you end up with this right-hand side. Now, this is a longer right-hand side compared to this one, but this is actually much easier to do this and less work than doing that. So why? Let's start with the mass conservation equations. If you combine them, you get divergence of u equals 0. Very simple. We got rid of the volume fraction there. U here is the one continuum or mixture velocity, which is defined like that. If you do the same thing with the momentum conservation equations, combine them, so sum them up together, well, you end up with this. And if you look at this, here you have your regular left-hand side from the single-phase Navier-Stokes equation. So if you already have a single-phase solver, you're not changing the left-hand side. If you look at the right-hand side, you have negative gradient of P plus mu Laplacian of U. So that's still the same thing as you would have in your single-phase flow solver. But then you have this additional term here, which is the immersed boundary forcing term. So this term here is a boundary integral. It's basically concentrated on the interface. Very simple to implement. The one thing to keep in mind is that what you're solving for is the mixture velocity and mixture pressure instead of the actual fluid velocity and fluid pressure. So if you're interested in this, you can look at the papers. You can also look at the flow solver I developed here. It's called Leap. It implements all these methods. It's open source. You can just grab the code and play around with it. So I'll show you very quickly some validation that I did here. This is just flow past a fixed sphere with reducing filter size, so 1/3 of a diameter to 1/9 of the diameter. The dashed line is a Schiller-Neumann correlation, and then these are prior simulations with the body fitted method and experiments that you see here. And we converged to a Schiller-Neumann drag with 1 to 3% deviation there. We looked at particle wakes. So we also capture these wakes very accurately and their dynamics as well. So for example, for Reynolds, below 200, you have these symmetric wakes. So we can measure the separation bubble length and angle, and this is what's plotted here. Getting this separation angle accurately requires more resolution than the separation length. So, but we do converge towards the reference data. At larger Reynolds numbers, for example, 250 here, you start having this asymmetric wake, which we also capture. So that was for a fixed particle. Now, what about moving particles? So we looked at comparisons with the experiments of Tenkate et al. And this is a particle in a cylindrical enclosure. So both particle and the cylindrical enclosure are modeled using our immersed boundary method that I just described. The density ratio is very low, so it's 1.1, kind of close to neutrally buoyant, but just the particle is just a little heavy. So this is what it looks like. And more quantitatively, we measure things like the vertical gap, the settling velocity, vary this for various Galileo number, which is a number that characterizes how fast the settling is going to occur, and the density ratio, and it all matches up. Here is another example where here we have a neutrally buoyant particle. So this particle is not fixed or anything. It's just, neutrally buoyant in the flow. And then you impose a simple shear. So when you do that, the particle is going to start rotating. So we measure the angular velocity of the particle divided by the shear rate and compared it with body-fitted simulations of Morris's group and other IBM method by Yu and Shao here. There's very good agreement. Even with these kind of filter sizes, so dp divided by 4, for example, gets us to the answer. Here's another example of drafting, kissing, tumbling. So we don't have a quantitative comparison here, but the simulations reproduces the physics that people observe. This initial stage where the particles are drafting, the trailing particle catches up with the leading particle, then they touch, that's called kissing, then that configuration is unstable, so they tumble and rotate. And lastly, here, this is what something that we were working on. We presented this at ICMF last week. This is a channel laden with neutrally buoyant particles related to a project on microplastic particles that we have. So we're interested in looking at the dispersion of microplastics in rivers. So this is a relatively small channel. The volume fraction here is 10%. Density ratio is 1. These particles are finite size, so their normalized diameter is 20. There are about 4,650 of these. So we just started out these simulations. This is the streamwise velocity here, and this is the solid volume fraction. So these simulations are still running. They're not we don't have converged statistics yet. But with our non-converged statistics, we're kind of approaching prior simulations by Bicano, as was showing there. But we definitely need to run this a little longer. So in conclusion, I showed you that particle-laden flows have very interesting dynamics. They're very worth it to study, and there's a lot to learn, whether it's from the numerics approach or whether it's from the physics viewpoint. What I also showed is that you can, in order to have good simulations, you really have to understand the scales involved, and you may need to deploy a method that's suited for that flow that you're looking at. So point-particle direct numerical simulations or particle-resolved DNS, depending on the relative scale that you're interested in. And using the volume filtering method, like I showed here, can be a unifying framework to do both PRDNS and point-particle methods. Now, another thing that I would like to here talk about very briefly is particle-resolved LES. So if you want to do particle-resolved LES, you're going to be in that configuration where the filter size is on the order of the particle diameter. So you're resolving the sphere, basically, in the flow, but you're under-resolving the flow on the scale of that sphere still. So you need to have some additional closures there, which are going to look very different from traditional LES closures or closures for point-particle methods. So this is something that we started working on. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of my group members and collaborators. So at ASU, I'm collaborating with Dr. Marcus Herman. A lot of this work emerged from interesting conversations with him. For everything that relates to dusty flows, this is work that I do with Anubhav Roy at IIT Madras. These are my students here. This is a picture from last year. These two students graduated already. One is doing a postdoc at Cornell, and the other is doing a postdoc at Max Planck Institute. And yeah, the other 4 are still in the group. And I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors. Most of it was funded by National Science Foundation. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, well, of course, completely familiar with the method you propose, but I have some reasons to be skeptical about.
Okay.
One of the things I know is that in this sort of relaxation method you mentioned, where they basically put a term to fit velocity you want, I have met different people that work with these things, and when you test them with very simple flow, for example, quick flow, you get something that is not very wrong, but in fact does not converge to the right solution.
Oh.
So have you tried to test your method in this very simple flow where you have an analytical solution that you can compare?
So I didn't do anything with the relaxation method, I must admit.
No,
I know that it's out there.
Well, for example, we did the channel flow, turbulent channel flow with, yeah.
Let me just show you. These walls, they're immersed boundary walls. Yeah. So you're saying I should drop turbulence, go to a laminar flow, and then compare with an analytical solution. I mean, we did a lot of that in the context of these simple validations, laminar solutions, and so on. You're saying I should do Couette flow with
convergence.
okay.
Linear velocity profile, and see if it works. Because I can tell you the relaxation method does not converge. It has an error that is related to the and it can be as low as 1%,
Okay.
smaller, but it does not converge to the right solution.
So I do wonder whether some of that error comes from the fact that you're doing a mixture formulation here, right? All these quantities are mixture quantities. So maybe the people that you talked to didn't realize that you have to pull out the fluid velocity from there. And
I'm just asking you if you verify with when converts to the right solution.
no, I didn't. We didn't. Yeah. To answer your question in a very direct way, we didn't do comparisons in a Couette flow. We did comparisons for a lot of these simple test cases here. I'm just showing you 3 here, but we've done like 8 or 9.
When you do this comparison here, if you have 1% error, you are not going to see.
Okay. But point taken. Yeah, point taken. I will go back and check for a Couette flow, and then I'll email you.
About the filtering size, because I feel like the assumption is kind of limiting in the gain you can have with the computation. So if you use that assumption that your filter size is small enough, for the case that you presented at the beginning with 10 trillion points, what would be the number of points that you can get down to using that?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So with this formulation that we have here, we kind of separated the grid resolution from the simulation resolution. So the simulation resolution is controlled by the filter size. You can have a lot of grid points, right? You can continue refining, but you're not going to get better resolution because that's controlled by the filter size. So in terms of actual practical grid points and grid resolutions, we typically do 4 grid points across the filter size. So I have 4 cells across 1 delta F. So when I do, for example, a filter size that's particle diameter divided by 4, right, a quarter of a particle diameter, it means that I have 16 grid points across that particle. It's four cells per filter, 4 filter lengths per diameter. So it's 4 times 4, 16.
So in your big case, so what would be typically the resolution?
Yeah. So anywhere between 12 grid points to 24 grid points. right? Depending on how accurate you want to be. Do you want to capture drag to within 2%, or do you want to capture drag to within 10%? And if you're doing a fluidized bed, capturing drag to within 2% may not be the most important thing. Your macroscopic parameters like solid flow rate through the pipe and fluid flow rate through the pipe may converge much earlier than, for example, the drag on each particle. I don't have an idea. I didn't do that simulation, but yeah, we're headed in that direction. Yeah.
Jacob?
Yeah, so two questions. One of them is in your continuum model, you said the inside the sphere, you said the density and viscosity to be the same as the fluid density viscosity. Why is that important, or it can just be theoretically anything, or it has to be the one-to-one?
So I think that you can put anything you want. Okay, I haven't really tested it. Anything you want, as long as it gets rid of volume fractions later in the equation, because dividing by volume fraction is where the issue stands. So the one thing to keep in mind is that we solve these equations in terms of the mixture velocities, but to compute the drag on the particle, you still have to go to the slide here and use this kind of formulation where you have a volume fraction here and you have that filtered fluid velocity. So
Yeah, I mean, this is like at least in the it's very similar to what's done. Like you're doing interfacial velocity. This is basically, but with just resolving the flow inside the sphere, it's basically like a Brinkman normalization type approach, or fictitious solid type approach that we use commonly. So it's not like anything new, but I just, when you said it was like it had to be the one-to-one, that's when I was like, I thought.
yeah, so I also, you can do like continuum mechanics, deformation mechanics, all the kind of equations there. This is my little note there. So I think all of those methods will work. Yeah. And I like this method because it makes it a very small change to an existing flow solver.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's similar things that have been applied.
Yeah.
By this. So that's second question was, if you have such a small void fraction, it's more a philosophical question, but if you have such a small void fraction, would using like AMR type approaches be efficient?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. I don't think you're going to get away with AMR, because at the end of the day, you're going to have a cell where you're doing that 0 divided by 0.
No, but I mean, just in general, like if you're doing, I don't know, like let's say AMR with some, let's say, modeling the solid as some rigid body velocity with like a moving mesh. But if the structures that are, let's say, imagine you have some structures that form around the solids, but where you can resolve, but away from the solid, which in your case, the solids are far apart.
Mm-hmm.
So then you can have coarser grids.
Okay.
In between each solid. So then you can take some, I guess it would be a multi-scale approach by.
All right, okay. So I think I've got another answer for you. The other answer is that here, with my approach, it's a filtered approach, right? So even if you do AMR to try to resolve near the surface of the particle better, the solution is going to be controlled by your filter size. You're not going to, it's not because you throw more grid points at it that you're going to get a better solution, because it depends on the filter size. Now, if you're saying, what if I have an implicitly defined filter size based on the grid that when I refine locally, I also refine my filter size, now you run into a different kind of issue, which is commutation errors. Because the equations will look very different when you have a filter size that varies with space. So you're going to get these commutation errors, and I think they're going to be very large in the case of AMR, because you do this coursing refining very aggressively. So it'll lead to very large commutation errors coming from the filter size, and that's something that's not easy to deal with. So in a sense, to go back to a philosophical point of view, I think these simulations have to be run with a constant filter size everywhere. and basically accept that you're not going to get better answers than what's determined by the filter size.
Okay, so it's 12, 10, so we will not solve all the problems two-phase simulations today, but maybe soon. So thank you again, Mohamed.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.